Before we get started, my name's Raphael, and I created this channel to share science fiction stories, the kind that stick with you even after they end. Everything here is made up, but full of emotion, tough choices, and moments that make you think. So, I'll ask just one small favor. If this kind of story speaks to you, hit that subscribe button. I'm working hard to reach my first 0 subscribers, and your vote of confidence really means a lot. And if you've got a second, drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. I love knowing who's out there on the other side. Now take a deep breath. The story's about to begin. Do you know that feeling of having your worth completely ignored? Of being seen as nothing more than a number? Or worse, as trash? That's exactly what we're talking about today. Get ready, because this is the story of a man who seemed invisible. Just a simple janitor, yet carried the weight and the power of humanity's last arsenal in his calloused hands. It's a journey of silent revenge and the true strength hidden beneath scars. Before we begin this powerful story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from today? The air on Citadel Station smelled like money and ozone. That's the only way Kael ever described it. The Cathar hegemony built that station not just as a hub, but as a monument to their own immaculate, suffocating superiority, and everything about it. From the polished, heat-sensitive xelium floors to the automated, whispering ventilation systems, screamed alien success. Kael, however, smelled like diluted industrial cleanser and sweat. He was on Deck 7, the diplomatic tier, where the floor required constant buffing to maintain the mirror sheen that reflected the towering, six-limbed Cathar diplomats and their glittering retinues. Humans were only allowed on Deck 7 in 2 capacities, as high-priced, disposable entertainment or as janitorial staff. Kael was the latter, and he was good at it. Invisible, efficient, utterly unremarkable. That was the point. Unremarkable was survival. He pushed the auto scrubber, the low mechanical thrum, a familiar counterpoint to the high-frequency chatter of the alien languages swirling around him. He wore the standard grey synth-wool jumpsuit, sanitized and anonymous. But the jumpsuit didn't cover the scars. They were everywhere if you looked. A deep, ragged line that ran from his left clavicle up under his jawline. A near miss from a plasma shard 10 years ago. Faint, crisscrossing etchings on his knuckles from corrosive runoff. And the worst one, the one he always subconsciously shielded, a spiderweb of white tissue across his left forearm, where a biodisruptor had grazed him during the siege of New Delphi. They were not scars of a janitor. They were maps of a war Earth had lost, but had never surrendered. Kael was 32 standard years old, looked 45, and was, by his own grim accounting, the last surviving custodian authorized to access the Earth's final contingency. The arsenal. He was focused on a particularly stubborn stain, likely spilled ceremonial synth wine from the VLOX delegation, when the entire atmosphere of the hall shifted. It wasn't a sound, it was a pressure change, the kind that happens when royalty approaches. Princess Lyra, of the Cathar hegemony. She was magnificent, in the cold, crystalline way that only the Cathar could manage. Tall, clad in an iridescent segmented armor that shifted color with her mood, escorted by 2 massive silent Praetorian guards whose bioscanners probably registered Kael as low-priority organic waste. Lyra wasn't heading anywhere specific. She was drifting, observing the lower species with the bored, detached curiosity of a zoologist examining a particularly dull specimen. Her eyes, compound and black, settled on Kael. He stopped the scrubber instantly, dropping his gaze to the floor, the mandated posture of deference. The silence grew heavy, broken only by the soft clack-clack of Lyra's articulated boots as she stopped directly in front of him. "You?" Her voice was perfectly modulated, a synthesized flute tone that cut through the background hum. It was delivered in flawless Terran standard, which the Cathar used exclusively for addressing human vassals, a final insult of forced intimacy. Kael kept his head down. Your radiance. Your designation. Kael, Unit 734. Lyra leaned slightly, the movement casual, yet radiating immense power. She didn't look at his face. She looked at his hands, resting on the handle of the scrubber. Your species is perpetually marred, she stated, not as a criticism, but as a scientific observation. Even when superficially cleaned, the dirt remains etched into the substrate. Kael's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He knew what was coming. Lyra reached out a delicate six-fingered hand, tipped with sharp, metallic claws, and, with astonishing speed, flipped his left arm over, exposing the New Delphi scar tissue. The Praetorians didn't move. The surrounding diplomats pretended not to notice. This was just a princess amusing herself with a human. This, Lyra said, tracing the jagged white lines with the tip of a claw, is particularly unsightly. A failure of regenerative therapy, or simply poor genetic stock. Kael felt the cold, hard memory of the biodisruptor burn, the smell of his own cooking flesh, the desperate order he'd been relaying when it hit him. He swallowed the bile of rage and replied with the practiced, flat tone of a servant. It is an old injury, Your Radiance, result of industrial accident during the early compliance period. Lyra laughed, a sharp, inorganic chirp. Industrial accident, such a quaint euphemism for primitive warfare. She turned the arm slightly, catching the light on the scar running up his neck. And this? Did the floor cleaner backfire? Or perhaps a petulant lover? Her mockery was not cruel. It was worse. It was utterly dismissive, treating his pain and his history as a joke beneath her notice. She saw the scars, but she saw them only as defects in a machine, not testament to a fight she couldn't comprehend. These marks, Lyra continued, dropping his arm carelessly, they are evidence of your species' inability to maintain control. You are forever tearing yourselves apart, even when granted the privilege of hegemony oversight. She gestured toward the clean floor. You clean the surface, but your history is permanently soiled. She straightened, her attention already drifting away. See that the floor is immaculate, Unit 734. We tolerate imperfections in our vassals, but not in our infrastructure. With that, she swept past, the Praetorians following, leaving Kael standing in the cold silence, the scent of ozone and condescension heavy around him. He waited 5 full seconds, the mandated time for the royal presence to dissipate before restarting the scrubber. The low hum vibrated through his hands, settling the tremor of suppressed violence. Soiled history. If only she knew. The scars were not blemishes. They were signatures. The neck wound was from the skirmish that bought the transport ships time to escape the orbital blockade. The forearm scar was from the final, desperate defense of the hidden data vault. The vault that contained the access codes, the schematics, and the operational parameters for the arsenal. His true identity wasn't Kael, Unit 734. It was Kael Rourke, Custodian of the Protocol 7 Omega. He finished the diplomatic tier shift in a mechanical haze, his mind running on a loop of Lyra's dismissive laughter. It was the same laughter he'd heard from the Cathar commanders during the surrender broadcast a decade ago. It was the sound of a species that believed itself utterly untouchable. But the mockery, while infuriating, was just noise. What happened next, however, was the signal. When his shift ended, Kael didn't head to the human barracks on the lower levels. He navigated the labyrinthine service tunnels, using his clearance codes to access the forgotten maintenance shafts, moving deeper into the station's core. The Citadel was immense, but it was built on something older. When the hegemony conquered Earth, they didn't want the planet, too messy, too resilient. They wanted the infrastructure and the strategic location, so they cannibalized the largest remaining Terran deep space vessel, the Triumph of Sol, and built their citadel around its fortified hull. The arsenal wasn't stored on the Citadel. It was stored in the Triumph of Sol. Kael reached sublevel 18, a section officially designated as decommissioned bio-waste processing, but which was, in reality, the sealed forward engine room of the old Earth ship. He deactivated the motion sensors and the low-frequency sonic alarms that only he knew how to bypass. The air here was thick and dead, smelling of ancient metal and inert coolant, the smell of sleeping power. He used his security key, not a chip, but a complex sequence of physical pressure points on a hidden panel, to open the first access hatch. It whined in protest, unused for years. He had never intended to open the arsenal. Protocol 7 Omega was clear. The arsenal was the last resort, only to be deployed when the total annihilation of the remaining human population was imminent, or when the hegemony moved to erase the memory of Earth entirely. He had always hoped humanity could survive through quiet compliance, through resilience and patience, waiting for the hegemony to collapse under its own weight or turn its attention elsewhere. But Lyra's casual cruelty had unsettled him, reminding him that contempt often precedes extermination. And then, there was what he'd overheard. Earlier, while buffing the floor near the Cathar High Command briefing room, the acoustic dampeners had momentarily flickered, a known glitch Kael had secretly introduced years ago. He hadn't heard much, just fragmented phrases, but they were enough to chill the blood. Final compliance measures for the new Eden Protectorate. Timeline acceleration due to persistent cultural contamination. Scheduled for systemic depopulation cycle 4. New Eden. The last, largest human enclave, clinging to a marginal asteroid belt far from the hegemony's core worlds. If the Cathar were moving to depopulate New Eden, it meant they were done with patience. They were done with vassalage. They were starting the final cleanup. The mockery was personal. The threat was existential. Kael stepped through the hatch and into the darkness of the Triumph of Sol's core. He activated the low-power emergency lighting. The corridor was narrow, lined with thick, pressurized bulkheads bearing faded Terran Navy insignias. It felt like stepping back a century, into a time when humans still fought for the stars, not just for the right to clean them. He moved quickly, his steps silent. He was the only one who had maintained these systems, performing slow, incremental repairs over the years, under the guise of calibrating historical magnetic interference. He reached the primary security door, a massive slab of depleted uranium alloy. This was the true entrance. The interface panel was old-school analog, designed to resist any Cathar digital intrusion. Kael placed his hand on the reader. The panel scanned the deep scars on his forearm, the map of New Delphi. The scars were not defects, they were the key. A synthetic voice, deep and gravelly, crackled to life, speaking Terran standard with a pre-collapse military accent. Custodian Rourke, identity confirmed, biosignature match, status, critical, authorization, Protocol 7 Omega override required. Kael spoke the code, his voice low and steady. Authorization. I initiate the last rite. The hegemony has moved to systemic depopulation. Prepare the deployment matrix. The door ground open, revealing not a vault, but a cavern. The arsenal was breathtaking in its terrible silence. It wasn't racks of standard rifles or cruisers. It was the desperate, terrifying genius of a cornered species. The chamber was dominated by 3 massive, inert artifacts, humming faintly in the cold light. The first was the Aegis Grid, a device designed not to destroy, but to lock down. A complete, localized singularity generator capable of collapsing all known forms of alien hyperdrive and communication within a sector, effectively blindfolding the enemy. The second was the Chrysalis Project, a biological nightmare. Self-replicating nanobots designed to target and disrupt the crystalline nervous systems of the Cathar, rendering their sophisticated armor and tech useless by attacking the wearer. The third, and most dangerous, was the Judgment Rods. Not missiles, but kinetic bombardment systems linked to the station's gravitational anchor, designed to accelerate dense, inert projectiles to near light speed, capable of penetrating even the Cathar's layered shielding. The rods were Earth's promise. If we go, we take the stars with us. Kael walked toward the central console, the weight of a dying civilization settling onto his shoulders. He felt the cold metal of the interface beneath his scarred fingers. He hadn't just been cleaning the hegemony's flaws. He had been lubricating the gears of their destruction. He initiated the system boot-up. The consoles flickered to life, bathing the cavern in harsh red emergency light. Warnings flashed across the screen. System integrity low. Deployment risk. Catastrophic. Recalculate collision vectors. He had to choose. Which weapon was the right one? The New Eden Protectorate needed immediate defense, but deploying the arsenal here, on Citadel Station, risked immediate Cathar retaliation that would wipe out every human within 1,000 light-years. He ran the diagnostics on the Aegis grid. It was the safest option, the most defensive. It would buy New Eden time, but it wouldn't strike fear into the hegemony. He looked at the Judgment Rods. They were the ultimate deterrent, but deployment meant sacrificing Citadel Station, and likely himself, the moment the Cathar realized what was happening. Kael leaned heavily on the console, staring at the holographic projection of Citadel Station, the heart of the hegemony's power. He remembered Lyra's face, the casual contempt in her eyes. He didn't just need to save New Eden. He needed to change the narrative. He needed to prove that the scars of humanity were not defects, but the signatures of a species that fights hardest when it has nothing left to lose. He needed a demonstration, a show of force that would make the Cathar choke on their own laughter. "Start charging the Aegis grid," Kael muttered, his breath misting in the cold air. "But prepare the targeting data for the Judgment Rods. We are going to put a hole in their superiority complex they can see from their capital world." He pulled up the complex schematics of Citadel Station, searching for the single, most crucial weak point. The place where a precise, terrifying strike would do maximum damage to the hegemony's morale, without immediately vaporizing the entire orbital structure. He found it. The Grand Diplomatic Hall, Deck 7. Lyra's favorite playground, the center of their arrogance. He had just started calibrating the initial launch sequence, a process that would take 12 hours of grueling, complex work, when the alarm system he had installed years ago, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor sensor linked to the station's deep core, began to pulse rapidly. Someone was coming. Not a patrol. The pattern was too specific. A high-priority, heavily shielded intrusion. Kael checked the internal access logs. The Cathar had just initiated a deep-core system sweep. A routine inspection, perhaps. Or maybe they had detected the minute power fluctuation from the arsenal's boot-up. Regardless, they were less than an hour away from breaching sub-level 18. Kael cursed under his breath. 12 hours of calibration was now 12 minutes. He had to accelerate the deployment, or the arsenal would be captured before it ever fired a shot. He slammed his hand onto the console, overriding the safety protocols. The chamber roared to life, the energy conduits thrumming with raw, desperate power. Warning! Protocol 7. Omega accelerated deployment initiated. Risk of catastrophic system failure. 98%. "I'll take the 2%, Kael grunted. He ignored the Aegis grid, focusing all available power on charging the Judgment Rods. He had to get one off the station, A warning shot that would rewrite the Galactic Order before the Cathar found the Janitor and his scars. He looked at the schematic of Deck 7, imagining the precise location where Lyra had stood, mocking the history of his species. Kael began typing the final coordinates, his hands a blur of practiced efficiency. The time for humility was over. It was time for humanity's final argument. The acceleration sequence screamed, a high-pitched, desperate whine echoing off the ancient bulkheads of the Triumph of Sol. Kael ignored the catastrophic risk assessment flashing red across his vision. The 98% chance of failure simply meant he'd have to be 100% precise. He had 12 minutes, maybe less. The Cathar Deep Core team wasn't just patrolling, they were slicing through the decommissioned levels with surgical precision. Kael's hands flew across the analog interface. He wasn't just a janitor. He was an engineer, a field medic, and a demolition expert. He knew how to fix things, and more importantly, he knew how to break them. His first priority was time. He couldn't fight the sweep team, but he could make their approach miserable. With 3 quick commands, Kael accessed the main plumbing manifold for sublevels 15 through 17. The section was supposed to be sealed, but Kael had kept the bypass valves lubricated. He rerouted the highly corrosive, concentrated industrial runoff, the sludge he usually cleaned up, into the main ventilation shafts leading to sublevel 17. He heard the distant, muffled sound of rushing liquid, followed almost immediately by a high-frequency alien shriek of alarm from the speakers above. 3 minutes gained. Maybe 4. He refocused on the judgment rods. They were not designed for finesse. They were designed for obliteration. The challenge was accelerating a single dense projectile, a slug of inert osmium, to the necessary fraction of light speed using the Citadel's own gravitational anchor system as a slingshot and hitting a specific spot on Deck 7 without triggering a full structural collapse. He needed to hit the diplomatic hall's central support spire, the spire that ran directly beneath the raised dais where Lyra had stood. A perfect kinetic strike there wouldn't vaporize the area, but the shockwave would turn the polished Zillium floor into shrapnel and collapse the entire opulent structure, making a statement that no amount of industrial cleaner could ever erase. The main reactor core of the Triumph of Sol was now online, vibrating with a heavy, dangerous rhythm. The energy requirements for the rods were immense, pulling power directly from the Citadel's main nexus. Warning: external power drain detected. Cathar Central Systems alerted. Time to intercept. Estimated 7 minutes. 7 minutes. He was still running the final trajectory calculations. The complex geometry of the Citadel, built around the old Earth hull, meant the firing angle was nearly vertical. Kael felt a sudden, sharp pain in his left forearm, the new Delphi scar. He realized he was gripping the console so hard the metal was cutting into the old tissue. He welcomed the pain. It focused him. He finished the calculation. The margin for error was less than a millimeter. Trajectory locked, he whispered, wiping sweat from his eyes. Target: Diplomatic Hall, Spire Alpha. The countdown began. 60 seconds. The sound of the Cathar sweep team was no longer distant. They had bypassed the corrosive sludge and were using plasma cutters on the outer hull of sublevel 18. The grinding noise was deafening, the air filling with the metallic tang of vaporized steel. Kael didn't look up. He was watching the rod. It was a massive, dark cylinder, now fully charged, mounted on the magnetic accelerator rail. T45 seconds. A section of the outer door buckled inward with a flash of white-hot plasma. 2 Cathar Praetorians, larger and more heavily armored than Lyra's guards, squeezed through the gap, their bioscanners immediately locking onto Kael. They didn't hesitate. Plasma rifles raised. Kael reacted purely on instinct, the muscle memory of the lost war taking over. He spun, grabbing a heavy metallic wrench, a tool of his trade, and hurled it at the nearest Praetorian's weapon joint. It was a desperation move, but it bought him a second. The wrench struck true. The Praetorian's shot went wide, vaporizing a century-old Terran coolant tank instead of Kael. The second Praetorian tracked him. Kael dove behind the main console, using the massive slab of electronics as a shield. 20 seconds. The first Praetorian recovered, shaking off the impact. It started to advance, its segmented armor clicking heavily on the metal floor. Kael didn't have a weapon, but he had the arsenal. He hit a small, unmarked button on the console, a secondary system designed to vent excess reactor heat. Instead of venting heat, Kael had rerouted the pressure valve to the chrysalis project chamber. A high-pressure burst of air, laced with the microscopic, crystalline nervous system disrupting nanobots, sprayed directly into the face of the advancing Praetorian. It wasn't a weapon designed for immediate kill, but for disruption. The Praetorian stopped mid-step, its movements seizing up. Its complex iridescent armor dimmed, then flickered violently. It stood there, paralyzed, a towering statue of hegemony failure. The second Praetorian hesitated, unsure what had just happened. 10 seconds. "This is for New Delphi," Kael growled, his voice raw. He slammed his hand down on the final activation sequence. Launch! There was no explosion, no flash of light, just a colossal deep thrum that shook the entire Citadel to its core. The sound was the pure, violent physics of mass overcoming inertia. The judgment rod was gone, accelerated out of the chamber and into the station's internal structure, utilizing the complex network of gravity plating as a railgun. Kael didn't wait to see the effect. He knew the Cathar would retaliate instantly. He had to secure the sector. He raced back to the console, ignoring the paralyzed Praetorian and the plasma smoke filling the room. The second Praetorian was finally advancing, its weapon charging. Kael hit the final, most crucial command: Aegis Grid activation. The Aegis Grid was designed to create a localized, impenetrable field of gravitational distortion. It wouldn't stop kinetic weapons, but it would collapse all known forms of faster-than-light travel, communication, and long-range sensor detection within a sector spanning several light-years. The entire chamber was flooded with a blinding blue light. Kael felt the air crackle with impossible energy. The second Praetorian fired. The plasma bolt struck the console Kael was standing behind. The shield held for a fraction of a second, but the heat was immense, slamming Kael backward against the bulkhead. Pain exploded in his ribs. He hit the floor, tasting blood and ozone. He looked up just as the Aegis Grid finished its boot sequence. The Praetorian stopped, its weapon drooping. Not because it was hit by nanobots, but because the entire environment had fundamentally changed. It felt the crushing, localized pressure of the Aegis field, locking down the Citadel. Then, the true shockwave hit. It wasn't the sound of the rod launching that mattered. It was the sound of the rod arriving. A massive, echoing gong reverberated through the deep core, followed by the terrifying sound of structural failure. It wasn't an explosion, but a catastrophic, localized implosion. On Deck 7, the polished xylium floor of the Grand Diplomatic Hall buckled, shattered, and collapsed as the osmium rod penetrated the spire directly beneath the dais. Princess Lyra of the Cathar hegemony, mid-sentence while discussing the logistics of the depopulation cycle for New Eden, found the floor literally dropping out from under her. The shockwave turned the mirror-sheen surfaces into razor dust. The arrogance, the immaculate superiority, the entire monument to Cathar success simply ceased to exist in that central point. The rod had penetrated, stabilized, and stopped, but the kinetic energy delivered was equivalent to a geological upheaval. Kael watched the Citadel's internal structural integrity diagram flash into the red zone on his shattered console. The diplomatic wing was gone. Not vaporized, but fundamentally broken. Silence descended in sub-level 18, broken only by Kael's ragged breathing and the soft, terrible hum of the Aegis grid, now fully operational, wrapping the Citadel in a bubble of isolation. The Cathar were trapped, blind, and bleeding. The second Praetorian finally moved, stepping over its paralyzed comrade. It trained its rifle on Kael, who was struggling to sit up, leaning against the cold metal. "You!" The Praetorian's synthesized voice was tight with shock and fury. "What have you done, lowlife?" Kael looked up at the towering alien. His body ached, his head was spinning, and the smell of burnt metal was overwhelming. But he was alive, and the rod had hit its mark. He lifted his left forearm, exposing the ugly, jagged white scar, the map of New Delphi. "I cleaned the floor," Kael rasped, a genuine smile, cold and grim, stretching across his scarred face. "But I told your princess that our history was soiled. I decided to make a down payment on the cleaning bill." The Praetorian didn't understand the metaphor, but it understood the catastrophic failure of its hegemony. It understood the silence of the collapsed communications, the pressure of the Aegis field, and the fact that the heart of their station was now a kinetic ruin. It fired. The plasma bolt struck Kael Rourke in the chest. The aftermath was immediate, brutal, and exactly what Kael had intended. The Citadel Station, trapped inside the Aegis grid, became a fortress of confusion. The Cathar High Command, cut off from their fleets and their intelligence networks, couldn't confirm if the attack was a single desperate act or the opening salvo of a new human counteroffensive. The destruction of the Grand Diplomatic Hall was a psychological masterstroke. It was not just a structural loss. It was the decapitation of their diplomatic hub, a public, visceral demonstration that the low-priority organic waste knew exactly where to strike. Princess Lyra survived the attack, pulled from the rubble by her surviving Praetorians. She was physically intact, but her crystalline armor was shattered, her face smeared with the dust of her own broken infrastructure. The experience did not inspire compassion. It inspired a cold, terrifying understanding. When the Cathar finally analyzed the debris and found the osmium rod, a simple, non-explosive piece of junk metal accelerated to lethal speed, they realized the truth. The weapon was not high-tech. It was pure, distilled human ingenuity, using the hegemony's own systems against them. They found Kael Rourke's body in sub-level 18, lying next to the smoking console. They found the remaining judgment rods, the schematic for the Chrysalis project, and the operational parameters for the Aegis grid. They realized that the quiet, scarred Janitor had been sitting on an apocalyptic arsenal for a decade, waiting for the precise moment to deploy it. The hegemony did not immediately retaliate against New Eden. They couldn't. The Aegis grid had bought the human enclave weeks, maybe months, of total isolation. More importantly, the Cathar decision-makers were paralyzed by fear and doubt. They had been ready to execute the final depopulation cycle, confident that the remaining humans were weak, compliant, and broken. They had laughed at the scars, but the scars were not defects. They were the key to the ultimate weapon. The message transmitted by the Cathar High Command to the remaining hegemony fleets, once the local comms were partially restored, was not one of vengeance, but of caution. The Terran species is designated Extreme Threat Vector Alpha. Reassessment of all compliance protocols required. They do not fight for victory, they fight for spite, and they will weaponize anything. The war was far from over. Humanity was still outnumbered, outgunned, and scattered. But they were no longer invisible, and they were no longer perceived as merely soiled. Somewhere, in the dark, isolated expanse of the New Eden Protectorate, the human resistance realized the Cathar fleets were not advancing. They realized the silence was not the prelude to annihilation, but a reprieve. And they knew somehow that the final, terrible argument had been made, not by a diplomat or a soldier, but by a man who had died cleaning up the cosmic mess the hegemony had made, proving that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is a human who has finally run out of floor cleaner.